Okay, hi everyone. My name is Alex. I'm on the Ember core for the last 9 months or so. I have if I can actually get this to work, I have a nickname that I've sort of earned in the last 9 months. It's Mr. Route, but the open source community has a tendency to bastardize it, and it's just Americanized to Mr. Router. This is what I see every time I look in the mirror in the morning and prepare for my day. To see myself as this majestic figure keeping spaghetti code at bay. As an exercise to the audience, try and guess what famous video game cover that is from, but don't say it loud enough for microphones because lawsuits. So anyway, I was originally going to be talking about the component, kind of the future of Ember components, and turns out that there's more interesting things happening in the router world. And I want to talk a little bit about how sort of my understanding of what belongs in a router versus what belongs in a controller has changed, particularly surrounding the new feature of query params, which has been sitting on Canary for forever. But I promise we'll eventually at some point go into beta when it's ready. But I think part of the goal of this talk is to sort of convey what's so tricky about it and why we are so anal about getting the API sheen that you've come to know and love from Ember right when it comes to query params. So I'm going to be talking about query params. I'm going to talk about sort of what the delay has been. I'm going to talk about a sort of missing primitive that's going to be the final piece to getting this thing launched, and give you a quick demo of that and take some questions at the end. So query params. For those not in the know, query params are basically key value pairs that come in the query section of a URL. So basically the thing to the right of a question mark. And so traditionally you have Ember is obviously very good at making you think about URLs as pretty much the first thing before you even sort of start designing the rest of your app. And query params is just something that we haven't really had a whole lot of support for. And as a brief history of it, actually almost a year ago, probably even longer, Alex Speller from London took it upon himself to write this query params library. It was standalone, it kind of plugged in, you would layer on top of Ember, and it would replace certain chunks of the code to sort of make it work. And eventually, I think after Ember 1.0 release sometime in the summer, it was actually merged into Canary. And then, probably not even 2014, but like Christmas, I gave everyone a Christmas gift of a rewrite of query params, and then had to rewrite it again because it's still something that's very hard to get right. So when will query params land in beta, says everyone. And it's complicated, but it's getting there. And then everyone just gives up and goes Angular. So get it together, core team. What's the deal? Why can't you ship? And well, it really just comes down to where should these things actually live? Classically, the router's been the thing that manages the URL, so everyone's sort of gut reaction is put it on the router. That's what I've been taught. That seems to be, every presentation about Ember that's introducing it is like, hey, we've got this powerful router. It's the center of everything. So obviously put that stuff there. That seems like the correct answer. And this is what Alex Speller's sort of router-centric query params API, that's how it worked. Basically, you would basically, in your router.map, which is one of the answers of the Ember Jeopardy, you would specify as part of the nestings of all your different app states, you would say for each route, what are query params that this route might be aware of, might know about, and whatnot. And so that seems like the sort of intuitive place to put things, but it had a lot of problems, which is that in an overwhelming number of use cases, you just want to get something from the query params in the URL to something that your controllers can see and respond to and maybe display or optionally display some like drop down in your template. And it actually kind of made you go through a lot of hoops to basically, okay, this is in a route. I'm going to take this thing from the query param, then set it to the controller, and then inverse in the other direction, I got to watch changes on whichever controller property is set by this thing. I got to make sure that when two different properties change, that we don't fire off two different kinds of transitions. So then you had to know about the run loop and Ember run that once and all this other stuff that ideally you shouldn't have to think about, particularly if you're just getting started. So somebody had the crazy idea along the way as this thing was just brewing on Canary. What if instead we shifted the focus from the router and the routes to controllers? And I thought this was a really dumb idea 3 months ago. Part of the goal of this talk is to be a confession because I'm still the guy that's supposed to do a lot of the router stuff. And before I even thought it was a good idea, I was like, fine, whatever, here's an API, it kind of works with controllers instead of the route, I'll just like implement it and then point out how clearly bad it is once I have some kind of MVP in place. But very recently, I've come around to my senses, and I hope to bring everyone there along with me. So this is an overview today. I'm trying not to be too verbose with all this stuff, but the basic idea with query params is that think about the controller where this information needs to be exposed to. It's going to be a route-driven controller, and you simply say query params sort by, and then sort by is just going to be a normal property on the controller, and that just automatically sets things up so that if sort by ever changes, your URL will automatically update, and if somebody presses the back button and that causes the URL to change the value of sort by, then that'll automatically update the controller. And there's all this bindings and other direction stuff that you don't have to think about. You don't have to coalesce these events into one. It's just super simple. So yeah, very, very simple. No need for custom observation, anything like that. It's also particularly in the last maybe month or so of iteration, there's some nice stuff that we do with kind of solving a problem which even in the Rails world is kind of annoying to have to deal with if you've ever grabbed a param and you've got to say, does this equal string true, or convert this to a number before I start using it in math operations. And largely, you don't have to do that because we're smart enough to look at the default value that you've supplied for this query param and say, oh, it's a number. Let's take this string 1 that looks like a number and actually convert it to a number so that you don't have to riddle your code with parsints or comparing things equal to true. Just a bunch of nice stuff that when you use it, it's like you don't notice all the hard stuff that you don't have to do. So it's very cool. It's getting there. And on the sort of classic route-centric thing, sometimes you have query param changes that need to cause model hooks to refire and basically be a full-on transition. We support that. That's something that you can configure on the routes. So query params, it's been there for a very long time on Ember Canary. Quick show of hands, who's got a production app which uses query params new? Right? You're not supposed to use Canary on production, but people do because query params are just that good. Special build. I don't know what code name you give that Canary. We'll just call it that for now. So a nice API, no doubt, but there's this sort of lingering question. So isn't it a code smell? Isn't it an API smell that this thing that the router, which classically had control over everything that's URL, why are we not using that and making it controller-centric? Like, no doubt the APIs, it almost seems like a shortcut, like we're cheating in some way. So is that a problem? And that was still my idea, less than a month ago. And it was the kind of thing where I would share this API with people, and someone would come back to me and say, I don't know, I kind of prefer it to be on the route. It seems like a route thing. And then I just wouldn't have an answer. I feel like I would feel extremely fake, like, you're right. What have I done? But I don't feel that anymore. It's great. I don't have to lie anymore. It's great. So it's not a problem. Here's why. So let's sort of think about what is the division of responsibilities. So what's the job of a controller? Job of a controller is to basically maintain, manage, manipulate app state. So you have your model. That might be something that's coming from the server, stored on some database, and then you have all the stuff that is specific to your application, like what of these models is selected? Am I displaying this optional thing in a template or not? So it kind of wraps the model, decorates it with information for presenting to a template, and it also just maintains just app state in general. And what is the job of the router? I mean, I probably, maybe a month ago, would have said a slightly different thing. I would have leaned more in the direction of trying to put as much on the route as possible. But the main thing that the router solves with its pretty awesome API is all the complicated stuff that has to deal with navigation and what has to happen to go between all these different nested hierarchies of controllers and templates and outlets and whatnot. And to deal with navigation and also basically make you think about URLs first. So before query params, I think one of the reasons that I had a really hard time accepting this sort of new way of thinking about things is that before query params were something that was supported in Ember, the only kinds of URLs that Ember was really capable of, unless you were sort of hacking around and doing your own custom thing, consisted entirely of the path form part of the URL. A URL has kind of many different segments. The path is the stuff that's all the slashes, like what I have there. And then following that is optionally the query, the question mark, whatever you choose to put at the end of it. So before query params, the router managed 100% of what the URLs were capable of in Ember. So it's kind of hard. It's very natural to think, let's just keep on doing everything that has to do with the URL on the router. But it doesn't necessarily mean that when we actually add this new thing that we're now going to support, that it all should just blindly go on the router. And it's turned out that once we've freed ourselves of that thought, the API could kind of show its power with this sort of controller-centric approach. So who should be in charge of stuff? Why not controllers? But URLs, they're tied to the router. That's like what the router does. But I think it's important to keep in mind all the other important things that the router does. So even if you had this is how you can turn off URLs in your Ember app. You can still have these nested outlets. You can still link around all over the place. You can still have error loading substates, all these amazing things that come with the Ember router. And it's just totally not dealing with the part that has to deal with URLs at all. And that's just, the router's already got a lot of responsibilities. If the URL becomes a secondary thing, responsibility of the router, if we sort of shift where that sort of belongs, no big deal. Don't be afraid. It's still very much part of the router, but my point is that now that we have this other part of the URL that we care about, it doesn't have to all entirely be the responsibility of the router. So the router definitely still has its work cut out for it. So where the sort of thought has shifted recently is that division of labor between what manages what part of the URL is that the router is going to basically handle the serialization of kind of controller hierarchies and templates and nestings and all the different child states that your app might have. That's what the router does, and that goes into the path. And then controllers are going to be responsible for serializing app data into the query section. So another reason that this is a sort of smart idea to take this stuff out of the router is that putting something into the query params is just kind of one way of serializing app state. Really, we have our sites set further than that, which is to also be able to say, hey, we've got this convenient API for saying page or sort by is going to be something that goes into the query params when it changes, but we also want to make it very easy at some point in the future to just say this is something that goes in local storage, so that when you refresh your page, it's just going to remember what was there and keep these items selected and whatnot. Query params are no doubt the most kind of social form of serialization, because you can just grab a link and send it to somebody, and they'll have a sort of slice of your app state that they can ideally see what you're seeing. And so basically, if you can imagine what it would have been like to have to support something like this, if you said, OK, I don't really want this. This isn't really important to put in the URL, because who cares if this weird piece of app state shows up on somebody else's browser or not. I'm going to move this to local storage instead, because it's still convenient to refresh your own browser and wind up looking at the same thing. If this were all still like a route-centric API, you would have to gut all of your query params configuration that's in your app.router.map. Whereas with the new way, it's just like, instead of query params, I'm just going to say local storage, and it'll just work. You don't have to change fundamentally how data gets in and out of the controller. So kind of all signs point to this being the correct place for this stuff to live. So furthermore, I hope we can all agree that the transition to approach to just changing what the value of a current model or the current these query param properties that might live on the controller, it's kind of ugly to have to. It doesn't really make sense to use transition to. You're not transitioning between hierarchies. You're not doing any of this complex navigation stuff. You just want to be like, hey, this property that was this should now be this, and I don't want to think about anything else. So that's where everything's leaning. So transition to is a wonderful thing, but kind of only when you're doing the complex hierarchical transition stuff between all these nested app states. So great, we figured it out. Why haven't we shipped? What's taking so long? And this is where the devil's kind of in the details, and you can get a sort of view into the world of crap that we have to think about. So, okay, say you enter a route, say it's articles route, and you change the sort by, and then you leave the articles route, you go check out the FAQ page, and you come back to articles, and there's this question of that property that you set, the sort by, is that going to be remembered when you come back in there, or is that just going to be refreshed to its original default value every single time? And you're going to have different use cases where there's not totally a clear answer to that, but there's definitely some things that we've learned along the way where there's definitely wrong answers to this question. So welcome to the dismal science of API design. This is unfortunately the kind of crap you have to think about before something moves into beta, because we definitely don't like shipping kind of half-assed solutions. And it's really has just taken a long time to figure out the right way to think about this stuff. So I think what we realized along the way when we were trying to delve into this problem a little bit is that there's kind of this missing primitive that's not really in Ember right now. And that's sort of what I've been working on the last 2 weeks and sort of what I'm going to kind of go into. So can it be done? Can we find this missing primitive? Of course, because I'm up here speaking about it. So we've sort of described this problem as controller property stickiness. Is it sticky? Is it remembered when you leave and come back? And we sort of wanted to think about the right way of categorizing when you would expect by default one of these properties to be remembered or not. For something like articles route, if you're just remembering which direction you're sorting things by, no big deal. That actually sounds like a pretty useful default to have. But if you are drilling down into like a detail controller, like show me information for this user or this post, and you've clicked a checkbox that says, I don't know, is active, or you're selecting and you're saving it for later because there's some other route in your app that takes all the things that you've selected and performs some operation or something like that. And you want to support the way of, you want to support being able to refresh this route, and then that's part of it still ends up selected. I mean, this use case might be a tiny bit flimsy because I'm just coming up with it now, but the idea is that you don't want to wind up in a situation where you are remembering these properties for a different model that when you come back to that route with an entirely different model is loaded, then suddenly those properties are still there. That's often not what you want. So I think what we realized is that there's this idea of, I'll just get to it, this idea of this primitive which is missing called model-dependent state. And controllers are definitely far from being able to sort of support that today, but so I've been working through some stuff that I hope the rest of Ember Core will agree is a good idea. They haven't really seen it. So what I'm demoing to you today is going to be news to them as well. So, so yeah, this is primitive of, I don't know if we want to call it a primitive, but this concept of model-dependent state, which isn't really being supported. And we'd really ideally like a way to remember these values, but only specific to a certain model. When you swap out the model, they go back to their defaults. Or we provided a nice way for you to configure this stuff, ideally figure out the high-level API, and then if you are industrious and just your app really needs it to be a certain different way, then lift up the hood and kind of see what's on the inside and kind of delve down to that lower level primitive. So, right, basically the example here is if you have an article, if you're drilling down to a specific article that's called some title, and then you mark it as selected, and then you go to another article that has other title, then it should not be selected, and then if you go back to the original one, it is selected again. That'd be a nice thing to have, at least as a default. If you can disable it, great, but we don't want to ship query params with this sort of weird behavior where all this stuff is being remembered for the wrong model. So we want to figure out how to configure such a thing. So kind of who consumes this new idea, this new concept? And it isn't just query params. It will be for now because we need to ship. But at some point, this is something that is shared between all the different ways that you could serialize app state, whether you're using local storage or IndexedDB. We still have to reason about making sure that when you cache these properties, they don't wind up clobbering the same sort of bucket that might belong to a different model. So anyway, so how's it implemented? At least my Mr. Router's vaporware of today, which might be totally rewritten when the rest of the course sees it. Basically, there is a global cache object, which will be injected on everyone that is going to be using this API, which right now is just controllers. And it is up to that controller, and we'll provide some tasty defaults to basically decide what bucket this state lives in. So for instance, if you are trying to keep track of is selected or something like that, that is going to live in this cache, but is going to be tied to a bucket that might say like articles plus the ID of the article, so that when you change the article that's loaded in there, it's going to go back to its defaults. But that's how you might remember these defaults when you actually load that original article in. And basically inside this cache, there is going to be a bucket for each bucket key, which gets kind of dynamically computed. And what's nice about all this is that this bucket, the creation of this bucket, whatever that slide is that it could just be a plain old JavaScript object, a POJO, which just means it's sort of in-memory storage. You refresh the page and you lose everything, but for the lifetime of your app, you've got this nice caching mechanism to remember this model-dependent state for a bunch of different models. But you could also imagine writing a sort of local storage proxy, which would not really be that hard to write, honestly, so that instead of creating a POJO for this bucket when you've had a sort of cache miss, you create this local storage proxy. So now you have this convenient way of going between all these different routes with different models, and even though it never was serialized into the URL, you're remembering what was selected, what was marked as interesting, or whatever makes sense to serialize kind of locally versus on a server. It really depends on your use case. So yeah, so I think what we realized is that we don't want to solve this problem and put in a possibly incorrect default at the query params level, but rather query params as a method of serializing app state is going to consume this lower level primitive. So I have a quick demo of this, what I had in mind. If I can not internet fail. Come on. JSmin. It's not a JSmin. It's actually some locally downloaded thing. OK, so I have two routes here. Well, a few different nested routes here. I have users, and presently there's a way that you can sort of remember information about. Sorry, one sec. So right now I'm basically iterating over all the list of users that are here right now, and each of these has an item controller, and the item controller has an isSelected field. And the goal of all this stuff, of course, is to remember what's been selected. And if I leave this route, and actually what happens when I enter this route is it's actually entirely reconstructing this array, so it's not just a matter of a previous data being set in there, sticking around and not reconstructing all these item controllers. We have these item controllers which are remembering their isSelected values. And we also have this other thing that I was toying around with, which is this scope key that you write here is actually part of what becomes the bucket key for all these different item controllers and where they store all this state. And if I were to say next state, and I basically have a new bucket where I'm storing all this stuff because I'm just changing the scope key right here. And I don't remember who I was talking to, but as we're sort of exploring this stuff, we're seeing how this can be a powerful concept, because somebody at the speaker dinner, maybe raise your hand if this is ringing a bell, was telling me about how the back button support of just being able to reconstruct previous app state for what Ember gives you by default is not really enough. There's a lot more information that needs to be stored beyond just trying to figure everything out from the URLs alone. So this is kind of getting you closer to do that. As you cycle between these states, you have this stored state, which is remembering all these previous different values. I also tried taking this, what is presently in the form of a mix-in, and putting it on a component which manages scrolling for you. And so for instance, if I scroll down here, and I leave the route and come back, because we're using this sort of shared cache, you can write something that actually remembers where you were scrolled to. So, so the goal right now is to take a lot of this stuff. Oh yeah, and if you click one of these things, you can remember if between Luke or Chris, it'll actually remember for that loaded model into the controller which one had this stuff open. So everything that I've seen from trying this out, which honestly is today is still a bit of a hack, vaporware, of course, seems very promising, and it definitely would solve a lot of issues. I've had multiple people kind of come up and say, like, hey, the router's great, just we keep on running into this issue where controllers are remembering stuff set from a previous route or a previous model, and it's kind of screwing things up. And I've sort of got to like paper over this every time we enter a route with, I don't know, throwing a bunch of imperative reset stuff on setup controller, and that's fine-ish, but it's causing, this is a more declarative approach of controlling how this data gets set. And there's more to be explored about it, but it seems very promising, and it seems very likely that it's going to be the solution for query params, at least, the thing that query params will use. So just a little bit more. I'll take some questions in just a moment. Oh no, I got this. Check this out. Yeah, I didn't serialize the internet into the URL. Wait for it. 5, 4, 3. Well, I can just click through these things, right? You don't need to wait for that. So basically, we've taken this thing which we've sort of had an accidental stickiness, which is, and sometimes it's like a desirable thing, but it's coupled to the fact that controllers often just, once they're instantiated, particularly a route-driven controller, it lives forever. So it obviously remembers all of its properties. It's never recreated, it doesn't get its default values again. So we've taken this thing which classically lives right on the controller, put it elsewhere so that you can do clever things with it and decide how these things are going to be serialized. And as a general roadmap, take this concept that I've been sort of hacking on the last 2 weeks, make it something that's a little more solid that query params will depend on, ship that even if the primitives are very low level at the moment, and then take some time to really think about how we can expand on this to make it the sort of more full-on solution for any kind of controller property, not just query params. So in short, to take something that is in Dr. Router's, Dr. Route's vaporwarium and actually get it on Ember Canary. So yeah, any questions? In the back. We need somebody to do the microphone skip.
So this seems to, have you thought about how somebody could serialize current app state to the server so they could persist it and retrieve it later? Because that seems like a very common problem we have.
One more time, are you talking about sharing?
So, yeah, for the stickiness of controller properties. It seems with this API, it seems very easy to cache them in an IndexedDB or local storage, but we often have a problem of trying to cache those on the server. So when the user later opens the app, he's in the exact same state he left.
It's actually very hard to make things out from the stage. I'm not totally getting the whole question. I will gladly talk about this for hours.
The answer is it's, the existing caching system would support asynchrony, so it would just be another kind of proxy that would be in charge of saving state to a server and also retrieving it from the server later on.
Sure, maybe. I think we need a little more time to think about asynchrony. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of use cases we can nail now.
That would be, the idea is we would design for that, and it would just work, is the ideal, right? So that'll be part of the discussion, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions?
Sam over here's got a question.
What's that?
Sam's got a question.
Oh, you had one. Oh.
Hi, on your slide regarding model responsibility, or actually router responsibility, you didn't mention models. And so in complex scenarios, sometimes your retrieval of models happens on the controller sometimes. Is that also being rethought, especially with query params often deal with model persistence and going back to the server?
Maybe in a very long term, it would be rethought. I don't think we have I think what's working for now, and it's actually on the query params new feature if people have been using it, is a way to opt into refiring the model hooks in case something changes. And so that's going to be the present day answer. Maybe as we have this stuff out for a while, we'll be able to think of the next phase. But it's definitely something we're starting to think about. Cool. I don't even see these questions. Oh, is everyone in the peripheral?
I was just hoping you could maybe do a gist about this like you did for the router, because I think we're all kind of trying to catch up and grok this.
Sure.
But this, yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Alex, can you do me a favor?
Yes.
A long, long time ago, in this talk, you had a slide that said they had the public API. The normal public API was you have a controller, you say query params, an array of things.
Sure.
I think people just got through the whole talk. Seeing that again might be helpful.
All right. It is a slightly different thing. So Yehuda was just suggesting going back to the here's an example of the query params API. Are you saying how? Sure.
Hopefully, the complexity of all the details hopefully can be something that people learn as they need things that are different than the default. People
So to repeat, this is the simplicity of this API is what I think we can realistically achieve. There's a lot of information we have to choose the ideal, most likely form of serialization for you. But if you need to, then you can drill down and look under the covers and do something more complex. But don't be scared. It's going to be as simple as this in the end. I think I'm out of time. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.